Jonathan Smith is, as many of you will know, the archivist at Wren Library, Trinity College, Cambridge, where so many of Wittgenstein's papers are safely deposited. In his research, he has closely examined, among other things, the papers of the economist Piero Sraffa, who was not only one of Wittgenstein's few continental European friends in Cambridge, but also one of his important philosophical interlocutors. Jonathan has also taught art and taught publicly, but from Witt's catalog of Wittgenstein's papers. And in recent years, he has done groundbreaking research on the compositional history of the Blue Book. So given his background, I'm really very excited to hear what he will have to share with us now. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Smith.
Okay, thank you, Enzo, and thank you, Radmila, for organising such a wonderful event in a wonderful city at a marvellous time. Well, the streets are quite busy. And it's lovely to see so many of my friends from the world of Wittgenstein studies here. So I'm very excited to be at such an event where we're discussing all sorts of archival material relating to Wittgenstein and his work. I'm not a philosopher, as you all know. My approach to the Wittgenstein corpus comes from an archival perspective. But because of the nature of the archives held by Trinity College, where I work, I've developed into an archivist specialising in the papers of academics, though I don't have such an impressive title as Alfred. So it's a particular type of archival perspective coloured with some influences of textual genetic theory. Having given evidence for both my credentials and for my bias, I should describe the aspects of the larger Wittgenstein corpus that we hold at Trinity. First and foremost, of course, is the larger part of the Nachlass of Wittgenstein's working papers, as defined by von Wright in his 1969 article. Somewhere between 90 and 95% of it. Von Wright tells us how surprised the three literary executors were to have his unpublished writings bequeathed to them, together with permission to publish those of the materials that they thought deserved it. And how Rush Rhys, as Wittgenstein's executor, received a box which he expected to be books from his library, perhaps copies of the Strand magazine, only to discover that they were manuscripts and typescripts produced by Wittgenstein since his return to philosophy in 1929. As we all probably know, in the subsequent 2 decades, the three editors found, and in some cases lost again, more manuscripts and typescripts, including some from the period before the publication of the Tractatus. Between 1951 and 67, when the editors produced a series of publications based on Wittgenstein's Nachlass, the individual items were shared out between the three and sometimes to trusted parties, depending on their particular editing projects, which they were working on at any particular time. Shortly after the English section of the Nachlass was brought together in order to microfilm them for the Cornell microfilm project, the literary executors deposited the material in the Wren Library in 1969 and established a trust to manage the Nachlass and the proceeds therefrom. Following their lead, members of the Wittgenstein family gave the manuscripts that they had in their possession to Trinity, and thus much of the known Nachlass was reunited in Cambridge. The story, however, does not end there, as in 1976 and 77, a number of other typescripts came to light and were added to the material in the Wren. When the last of the three executors died, the ownership of the Nachlass and copyright therein passed to Trinity. So, as I say, you probably all know that, but that's the extent of the Nachlass material at Trinity. But by no means does it exhaust the Wittgenstein material we have in the library. Firstly, there are some materials that intellectually belong to the Nachlass, though they arrived in Cambridge via a different provenance from Wittgenstein or the Wittgenstein family. To this class of documents belongs the early version of the Blue Book that Wittgenstein gave to his friend Robert Thewlis and presented to the library by his son, the Nobel laureate David Thewlis. This version contains many alterations in Wittgenstein's hand on what must be the typescripts made by a student from the twice-weekly discussions on which the Blue Book was based, and which were introduced into the text before the original cycler-style copies were made. In addition to this remarkable item, we have some less interesting copies of the Blue Book, including one that once belonged to Margaret MacDonald, the first volume of G.E. Moore's copy, and a copy of unsure provenance. Piero Sraffa's copy, which had belonged to Francis Skinner, unfortunately disappeared from Sraffa's library before his death, but would have come to Trinity with the rest of his magnificent library, which Sraffa left to the college on his death in 1983. It's interesting and typical of Sraffa that within days of the publication of the first edition of the Blue Book, Sraffa shot off a letter to von Richt with details of a correction that Wittgenstein had made in his own copy, which was included in the second edition. Speaking of Skinner, the Wren currently plays host to a small archive of manuscripts of Francis Skinner, Wittgenstein's partner in the 1930s. These are on long-term loan from the Mathematical Association. I must not say much about them because Arthur is poised to speak tomorrow and surely knows more about them than I. But I will go so far as to say that at least some of them are as worthy of a place amongst the Nachlass as the blue and brown books. Included in the Skinner materials are notes of lectures by Wittgenstein, and this is another class of Wittgenstein-related material that we have in the Wren. We have a number of originals and copies of students' lecture notes. Now, they have to be carefully differentiated from the dictations that Wittgenstein made to numerous amanuenses, including Skinner. Authors of these notes include J.E. King, Yorick Smithies, Peter Geach and Rush Rees. This morning, Joseph talked to us about Wittgenstein's correspondence. At Trinity, we can claim just a few bundles. Von Richt gave us his correspondence with Wittgenstein, which he had published in the Cambridge Review. Norman Malcolm gave us his letters, which were published with later editions of his memoir. And in addition to these philosophical friends, the library acquired letters from Wittgenstein to two non-philosophers, Roy Foraker and Gilbert Pattison. More recently, we twice had to dip quite deeply into funds to recover letters from Wittgenstein to his friend, the economist Piero Sraffa, that had disappeared from Sraffa's rooms in his latter years. These came together with Keynes's letters to Sraffa. In John Wisdom's papers, we have a short exchange between him and Wittgenstein. We also have a few administrative letters relating to Wittgenstein's return to Cambridge in 1929 and his request for money from Trinity, and a long letter that he wrote to the College Gardens Committee about garden design. Much of these Cambridge ones, particularly the Sraffa letters, are in Brian McGuinness's latest edition of Letters from Cambridge. And certainly I think the arrival of the Sraffa letters in Cambridge prompted him to produce this edition. Mentioning Sraffa, I mean, we know that Wittgenstein valued his input greatly, and of course he mentions him in the preface to Philosophical Investigations. And it was always lamented that Sraffa's letters were missing, because surely these would tell us, would finally tell us exactly how he had influenced Ludwig. Well, unfortunately, they're not quite as interesting as that. Although they do give hints, and there are included amongst them a few papers which are notes of or for notes of or for discussions that Wittgenstein and Sraffa had in the 30s. And there are also one or two of these in Sraffa's own papers, which is a large archive, actually, quite a bit larger than Wittgenstein's, which relate to these type of discussions. And there's also a very brief notes on the Blue Book. Perhaps I should also say that this material is online. So if anybody wants to have a look at it, if they head via Trinity College Library's homepage, they should find it. Finally, the library holds papers produced by Rush Rees as editor of Wittgenstein. Rees's personal papers and papers relating to his own academic career are held at the Richard Burton Archive at Swansea University. As ever, in cases like this, where one portion of an archive is ripped from its proper place, the division between the two parts is not perfect, and some Wittgenstein-related materials remain in Swansea. The Trinity papers contain mostly photographs and photocopies of Nachlass material, and many typescripts made by Rees, some of which are annotated. How much we can get from this material and how useful it is in helping us understand the process of the literary executors in editing Wittgenstein, I'm unsure of, but a number of Wittgenstein scholars have used the material, and I hope to some purpose. So there ends a brief description of Wittgenstein-related material we have at Trinity, and I'm sorry if I've missed anybody's favourites. In the second part of this talk, I'd very briefly like to look at the Nachlass itself, being the major shareholder, as it were. And I'd also like to remind and maybe even warn those present that while we're considering the greater Wittgenstein corpus, each limb has its separate properties, which set it apart as a source for Wittgenstein's life and work. And while if we see these various sources simply as texts, they may appear to be similar types of evidence, on deeper investigation they are quite different due to their origins, nature and purpose, invisible attributes which can tell us a great deal. And any scholarly endeavour that seeks to bring together differing types of source material should always seek to preserve these differences and the reasons for them. We should not attempt anything that erode the evidential differences of this type of material, as that would be yet another nail, I fear, in the coffin of scholarship. There's one aspect about the Nachlass, or question really, that rarely gets asked. I mean, it's just one of the simplest of ontological questions. What is it? What is its identity, if I dare use the I word in front of this audience? I mean, we can ask what seem the right questions of something, and not knowing exactly what it is, we get the wrong answers. And certainly the more we know about an archive and the purpose of its creation, the more likely we are of getting the correct answers from it. I mean, one answer to the question, what is the Nachlass, might be what von Wright made it. I mean, his article, the Wittgenstein papers, very much set in stone what the Nachlass was and what type of material was considered Nachlass-type material, though he didn't set its limit. In that similar Wittgenstein materials were found after 1969 and incorporated into the later editions of the catalogue. One interesting feature which has been alluded to all day was that he tried to incorporate material from other archives where the intellectual input was essentially Wittgenstein's. And this is most evident in the section that von Richter allocated for dictations. I just want to talk briefly about what I see as being the archival perspective of looking at the Nachlass. I mean, as archivists, we tend to see archives not as single documents, but see them as organic groups of records that build up naturally over time, grown, as we may say. They reflect the process that they were created to record. Well, the process changes, the record changes, but often the process, once established, remains constant over many years. And in dealing with this material, archivists seek to preserve the context and interrelationship between the documents of an archive in order to ensure that they reflect as well as possible the process that created it. And in doing so, they preserve the record's naturally high evidential value. So from an archival perspective, I see the Nachlass and archival resources like it as a record of the cognitive process of writing. And while every author develops different processes in the production of their work, there have been some useful attempts to describe the general aspects of the writing process which underlie their individual methods. John R. Hayes and various colleagues have spent 30 years producing various models and that of the cognitive process of writing, which I actually find quite interesting. I mean, in simple terms, for Hayes, writing happens thus. A process he names the proposer, proposes ideas for inclusion in the text, drawing on long-term memory, source texts, the sensory environment, etc., for inspiration. These ideas are then passed to the translator to translate the non-verbal concept into strings of text, and only here do we start getting the record. These are polished by the transcriber and judged by the evaluator. These are all parts of the process. The evaluator might reject the text produced or demand its revision. Evaluation can take place immediately or at some time removed, and if in the latter case, evaluation is likely to take place of a written record of the text used as an extension of long-term memory. Numerous iterations of the evaluation, translation, and transcription processes can take place in the rewriting of a text. The result of such a process might look something like the Nachlass. I mean, crucial for the creation of records are the limitation of working memory, the memory used to handle the various processes which are working at any given time. Studies suggest that most people, even experienced writers, are only able to hold in working memory a surprisingly small number of words of a composition before a record of this has to be made. And this is where texts like the Nachlass, this is how they develop. Why do I think this view of the Nachlass is important? One reason, of course, is evidential value, that abstract attribute of a document that is crucial in helping us to decide whether it is a reliable source or not. Provenance, of course, is a crucial element of evidentiality, and fortunately we can be sure that the vast majority of items in the accepted Nachlass come from good provenance. But the relationship between documents produced by Wittgenstein's process also has a strong implication for evidentiality. And the better three-dimensional model of the Nachlass we can build up with its myriad interconnections, the better we can trust the data we extract from it. I mean, another reason, and a simple one, for viewing the Nachlass as a record of Wittgenstein's compositional process is that we get a greater sense of the development of Wittgenstein's philosophy over time. I mean, for example, the later versions of von Wricht's catalogue list two versions of the big typescript, one with and one without annotations, simply. But examination of the two reveals a much more fluid and complex developing of a text, drawing on earlier manuscripts and reaching forward to later ones than appears in the catalogue. Another reason is we get a sense of the various projects on which Wittgenstein was working and how some manuscripts input ideas to more than one project. You know, we talk about people talking about a work by Wittgenstein or looking at, you know, the entirety of the Nachlass as a work. I kind of think, you know, if we look at the projects that he was involved in throughout, that helps us, gives us an idea of breaking down the Nachlass into sensible groupings. I just want to give a little demonstration of why I think the understanding of the process helps us garner evidence for the development of Wittgenstein's ideas, or that can be used in understanding the development of his ideas, and also will help editors of his work. And that's the marginal marks that we're all familiar with and run certainly for the entirety, pretty much for the entirety of his post-1929 period. But we have to put ourselves in a situation where we're coming anew from this, where we've not looked at it before. I mean, we might first notice that these marginal marks, a marginal mark, and wonder what its significance is. And then we notice there are more of them. When I say marginal marks, I'm talking of the slash or the long S, which may be schlecht. But while we see, you know, that there are many of these, we don't know what their significance is. I mean, Wittgenstein does not explain what they are there for. There's no handy key. So discovering their purpose must have been a matter of induction. And only when we get to the next stage of Wittgenstein's process does this become evident. When we see that those remarks with the slash in the margin are transferred to the next part of the authorial process, and those with the S mark or not, we begin to understand the purpose that these markings have and their significance for editors and interpreters of Wittgenstein's work. Now, the point I'm making is this is something we can discover from non-verbal communication and an understanding of the process and the interrelationship between the individual items of the Nachlass. And I have to say that we're very fortunate to have the Bergen Nachlass edition available on Wittgenstein's source because in order to get a full understanding of the process, you really need to see as many of Wittgenstein's manuscripts as possible. And I'm sure somebody who was into induction would probably say that the greater percentage of items you see gives you more chance of coming up with a correct answer. So the larger the data set, the better. Just because of its comprehensive nature, the Bergen Nachlass edition is a powerful tool for this type of research. So, I mean, I've tried to set the Nachlass apart from other items in the Wittgenstein corpus, not because I don't want to see a project where all are joined together, but just to indicate that I feel that it's a special case within the corpus. I mean, there are potentially other special cases as well, and this is certainly not the only weapon in the scholar's armoury. I mean, correspondence, diaries, students' lecture notes all give us clues as to what Wittgenstein was doing at a particular time. As Alois said this morning, you know, if there's a particularly interesting remark Wittgenstein makes on a particular day, and you saw he had a discussion with Sraffa, that might take you along a path which leads you to believe that Sraffa maybe influenced him in some way. I mean, they help us discover the biography of the man and the context in which we can place his work. And each of them produce different types of evidence for different aspects of Wittgenstein's life and work, which have to be investigated in different ways. So, firstly, just to finish, I will be very, very much behind any project that saw the greater Wittgenstein corpus going online in an intelligent way. But my one caveat is we have to preserve the evidentiality of each particular type of document. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there are going to be many questions.
Yeah, first question. Volkemund and then others.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this beautiful presentation. I think it was in Certosa last year you were talking about what will happen after 2021. As far as I remember, you said the copyright will not fall for all the Wittgenstein material, but only for parts of it. Could you make a few comments on that again?
Yes. I have to do some sums here. I think, don't quote me on this, but when the law on copyright, when the British brought their copyright law in line with European copyright law, there was a problem because in Britain, previously, unpublished manuscripts had perpetual copyright. So that actually means that some of the medieval manuscripts that we have in the library are still in copyright, which seems a bit bizarre anyway. So trying to bring it in line, they had to put in a provision for owners of copyright owners of modern manuscripts in order to let them have a reasonable period to receive monies or whatever, or control the manuscript. So that what they said was anything that is unpublished in 1989 will go out of copyright in 2039. I mean, there are arguments to be made that some items may have been published before then. Yeah. But what I also mentioned that day, which is the tricky thing, is the way the British courts work, which tend to give judges or judges' opinions a greater value than, say, certain courts in certain European countries. Yeah. So, essentially, the way of finding out is going to court.
Okay. I think there's Alois who had a question.
Thank you, Jonathan. Two things. I would now be very eager to hear from you which you think were Wittgenstein's projects. A list of Wittgenstein's projects. And then thank you for bringing up the section marks. And that brings us back maybe to Christoph's talk, because I always wondered which of these marks in the margin have to do with the Weizmann Wittgenstein project. And I wonder whether anyone has actually looked at what Weizmann excerpted from manuscript 114, 115, and which went into in the end, into Logik, Sprache, Philosophie. So, Christoph, maybe you can also help answer this question. But has anyone really done this comparison? And if not, Christoph, something to do.
Yeah,
by the way, you can on the Wittgenstein online site, you can filter all the transcriptions, the manuscripts, in accordance with the section marks. So if you're interested only in the remarks in MS105 that have a slash, you can get all the remarks in MS105 that have a slash and only those remarks. And that could help with that research. But there must be something. I mean, Weizmann has been sitting, I suppose, on manuscript 114 partly, and really read it, looked at it, and they do have maybe talked. This shall go into our common book, and this shall not go.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting.
Okay,
I mean,
that's interesting.
that's
I would like to have the list of projects, and I'm going the list of projects.
well, yeah. But I mean, things like, for example, he one definable project was the work he put together when, I think it was when he was asking Trinity for money, but other things like the obviously the big typescript is an area, you know, we can cut off, but the post 1945 work is kind of like two projects going on at the same time.
Precisely, that would be an area where I think people have then some disagreements. Was there another project after the investigation?
Maybe we should get the mic.
Philosophy of psychology.
The mic, please. Thank you.
So I wondered what you think from your point of view. So there are two projects going on there after 45.
Well, yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And well, that's kind of it's of course after 45 it's the record of the process gets looser. Mm-hmm. So, you know, given the fact that a lot of the things you can extract from the record of the process before then are perhaps conjectural. Certainly by after 45, it's a lot more difficult. But yeah. I mean.
And do you think there's a Brown Book project or something which we can call Brown Book project?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's the Brown Book, there's the translation, and then it moves it, you know,
into the investigations project.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, the point is, of course, there are always good ideas, good remarks being picked up and moved around into. He carries his good ideas with him through, but I do certainly. It's clear that he changes his concept of what he was doing throughout his life. I mean, it's not the idea of, you know, the phrase "my work" or "my book," should I say, being the same from 1930 to you know after the war. I don't think correct. I mean, it's not a single linear thing as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation, Jonathan. My question is about the concept of the Nachlass that you were talking about, and it's very helpful and illuminating in a lot of ways to think about an author's compositional process and the development of their ideas in relation to the documents that we then have as evidence for that. But I'm wondering, you seem to emphasize the process and a process of composition. And I'm wondering if you could speak to maybe the way that Wittgenstein has multiple different processes that happen at different times, maybe related to different projects. But I'm also thinking about things like when he comes back to Cambridge in the 30s, he's lecturing. And so the process of lecturing provides, I think, different starting points for some of his ideas, where he writes them as lecture notes first. And right, I'm repeating things you know probably better than I do. But the point is just to say that, would you say, or could you comment on the different processes, plural, that Wittgenstein went through or that we have evidence for in the Nachlass, and then how to think about plural processes as something that can still be encapsulated in the idea of a Nachlass?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I do have talk about the process singular, but you're quite right. There are various processes going on. I mean, your own project. I mean, it's hard to believe that the process that Wittgenstein used in his later philosophy was the same process that he used to produce that. You know, especially things he was using. It's more like the Blue Book process, really. You know, but I feel that there are aspects of the process which you see from 29 to, well, maybe not 51, but yeah. And these I include some of his markings, the way he indicates moving material about, the use of Zettel to shuffle things and things like that. But it's I mean, certainly it's clear the use of dictation as well, you know, is an interesting sort of part of his process. But yes, I mean, you're right, it's clear that when he's writing, for example, lecture notes and things like that, material may come out of that, but I don't think that the process as recorded is quite the same as when he is, I don't know, sitting down somewhere with a notebook doing philosophy, as he said. So yeah, I mean, there will be kind of like maybe a sub-process, alternative process, whatever you like to call it. Yeah. But I mean, it's. I suppose my approach is a little bit conceptual in that this is the way I see it, but I'm sure other people, with being able to do deeper research, could come up with a better idea of aspects of the process.
Arthur Gibson.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your thoughts and everybody else's. Metadata is an interesting domain, and it may be that it's, at this point, is analogical to metadata, but you could say the following is metadata. What are Wittgenstein's own terminological ways of identifying his process and his themes? One of the most obvious ones is game. So the general point then would be look for themes in relation to the process. The most obvious example, yet deceptively tricky, is game itself. And so, as I was suggesting earlier, one of the marking differences between the earlier Wittgenstein Tractatus and later is the use of game. But already, soon after the Tractatus, he's noting that some mathematicians, some of whom he had read up and even went to conferences and picked up from others. So the word game in Weyl's mathematics is a term that he uses, And interestingly, it's used by people like John Conway today, and was used by Ramsey in K-theory, where there's an exponential run in the expansion of the game. And so the philosophical games begin, as it were, the term game in the philosophical investigations begins much earlier on. I think then you need a measuring language, which we could get from games, from Wittgenstein's own terminology. I won't develop this in detail, but I'll just say you need a criterion of discontinuity or of ascendance or transformation or discontinuity in the word game. So if it's linked to a way in which it hovers, trying to cover the Tractatus, the game is lost. And Wittgenstein in the middle is exploring how various areas of maths, and those as analogies for his ordinary language philosophy, in which he isn't playing a mapping game, because he pointedly saying, really, what is the set of all games? Well, it's not a game, but it's still a set of games. So he's playing an intricate game here, in which you need a measuring notion of continuity, discontinuity, and that's where confusion happens. But it isn't just personalities, it actually is him thinking very hard. So the notion then of the meta-language that Wittgenstein uses as terminology to identify his own processes and switch of theme and development should be looked at, as well as when they become discontinuous with themselves. Fits in with what you're saying, I think.
I wonder, and I wonder if that's more kind of relates. I mean, it seems hard to split these things apart, but I do like to differentiate between the cognitive process of writing and his process of doing philosophy. And I wonder if that falls in the latter.
Would you say that again, just so I can reflect on it, John?
So I do like, there are reasons why I do this, which I'll explain if you need, but I do like to differentiate between his cognitive theory of the writing and his process of doing philosophy.
Could I just add to that? Forgive me. You could look upon the whole notion of multiplicity of games and other themes as a polymorphic set. Bring Mikhail Bakhtin, and I think you could make a connection here with Nick Bakhtin up in Birmingham, but we won't pursue that. But apply it straight away to the Blue Book. As you pointed out, it's like a rule book, and it's a teaching book. I think that's almost an ironization of his earlier teaching, which he expands it. But secondly, rather than regarding the Brown Book as a rather messy version of that is how you do the same subject but as an experiment, in which it will crash, but it's a crash that will produce a transformation. That leaves us with the idea of a polymorphic set. There is evolution, but these are not junk evolutions where the Blue Book or the Brown Book is a vestigial organ on the way to the philosophical investigations, even though it is in a sense. I think Wittgenstein is pluralist thinking, experimenting with different sorts of processes and different outcomes, which fits, I think, what you're saying.
I'm still not sure I agree, but
Yes.
we'll have a chat over a beer.
I think your talk, Jonathan, put the finger on something potentially problematic. Like if we look at the so-called Werkausgabe, right? We have the philosophische Bemerkungen, and then we also have the Bemerkungen zur Philosophie der Psychologie, right? But if we now listen to what you said, that we really have to look at the process, at the compositional process, then the two works are on entirely different levels, like Philosophische Bemerkungen has come about through precisely the process you have been describing. I mean, first a selection, then a rearrangement of the TypeScript, and then it was put together to what has been published as 209, while the remarks on foundations of psychology that are also considered a work, they have only reached the level of the 208, right? It was just a selection of remarks from manuscripts, and that's it. There was no further no further cutting into pieces that were rearranged. So do you think it's fair to say, I mean, or at least one has to contemplate that all those works, so-called works, that have not gone through that rearrangement process, that only have reached maybe the first level, or not even the first, and not even the second level, not even the level of being dictated into a TypeScript like uncertainty has not, there we only have more or less the first drafts. Is it fair to derive from your talk the conclusion that we have to be much more careful about attributing sort of work status? I know you prefer to talk about projects, not works, but still, I think it's important to keep this in mind. How many levels of editorial processing has the piece gone through? Would you agree to deriving such a conclusion from your talk?
I've actually never thought of it from the point of view you're coming at it, actually, but yes, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, obviously the latter works, you know, I mean, the question is whether Wittgenstein would have followed his usual process with that later material. We'll probably never know. But, you know, you've got to think that the likelihood is that he would have, if he'd have felt strong enough, and I don't mean just physically strong enough, I mean mentally strong enough. But, yeah, but it does bring up the question, what is a work by Wittgenstein, you know? Obviously this is kind of what Joachim is banging on about. But where you can draw the line between how much of the process, how much of Wittgenstein's usual process has to be used in producing a text which people pick up and use as a work. I mean, that's a difficult question, but yeah. I mean, I see very much your point. Yeah.
Okay.
I find it interesting that you still use the expression usual process. You don't say earlier process, you still say usual.
Okay, yeah.
It's not only, I mean, some would say it's only the middle Wittgenstein's process. But I think it is the usual.
Yeah, I mean,
from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, I mean,
could
just
at least be.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay. Any further? We have another 40 minutes of questions, I hope. And let's try. Or maybe I can ask a question if no one else has a question. Yeah, okay. Jonathan, I wanted to ask you, your institution has been a crucial partner in the collaborative effort of globalizing access to Wittgenstein's writings by collaborating with Wittgenstein's source. And I was wondering what was the local impact that the success of Wittgenstein's source had on your institution? The one impact that is noticeable is that we have fewer Wittgenstein readers come to look at the original. So you're better able to protect the materials?
This is a touchy subject at the moment because we're having to conserve all of the TypeScripts. The problem with the TypeScripts, of course, is are not the top copies. It's so yes, we potentially yes, but there are some very obvious reasons why people need to look at the originals. I mean, we've got brilliant, well, really good images online now, haven't we? Very good images. But, you know, as we discussed earlier, certain things like working out if the same sort of pencil was used into it. You've got to look, you need to see both originals next to each other. So I would hope there would never be a day when the originals were not available for scholars. It's just sometimes things have to be held back for a bit until we can preserve them better. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. It's very interesting. Alois has a question. I think it's turned up.
If I've understood, I don't know, Alfred, did you say that since the Nachlass is included as Weltdokumentenerbe, it's more difficult to get access to the originals than it was before? Did you say that, or have I misunderstood something? That they are now so important that access is more restricted than it ever was before.
I don't would make a direct connection between these two things, but anyway, we have the same opinion as Cambridge, that only if there are really strong reasons people can still use the original manuscripts, and most of the cases it's enough to use the digital copies of the Nachlass. So you cannot come to the library and say, I want to read the Tractatus, give me TypeScript 204, for example, but then you should use another thing. But I wouldn't say this was the reason because it was listed in the UNESCO Memory of the World list. It was also before. So this is, of course, one of the outcomes of digitization, that the originals are more protected and more difficult to use. Or there is no. We are not so happy if people want to use the originals, of course, if they don't have really strong reasons.
I think Arthur has a question.
I don't want to extend things beyond.
We have another 30 minutes almost.
Yeah. Just a note from earlier in the day, someone asked about Priestley. Probably people know, but if it's the same Priestley, he wasn't professor, he was the registrary at Cambridge University and went to, was it Sydney, eventually, personal, professional friend of Wittgenstein's. And people may like to know, if they don't, that in the university archives there are a series of his letters and also Wittgenstein's letters to him in large print, which is rather interesting, and not least since some of them, about 8 of them, concern Ambrose. And have I time just to mention what they are? Because it's rather interesting for 2 reasons. Firstly, Ambrose leaves the impression in her letters to various people, not least Mrs. Moore, that Wittgenstein's been rather a bitch, excuse my language, when actually articulates, yes, thank you. And the real point is that Wittgenstein is writing to Priestley exactly at the same time, saying, please don't charge this lady the fees, she can't afford them. Next letter, no, please don't put her under pressure because she needs to learn. 2 more letters. No, she really needs to learn, and it's underlined 2 and 3 times, which relates to the theme of learning very much, because it's quite clear that she is using her professionalism and her background as a PhD maths student in the States, which was to do with standard learning, and she hadn't learnt the sense of learning that he is talking about. And so the other letters then say later, please would you allow her to go back to the state and still receive it? We'll sort the examination out. Next letter says, please would you exclude her in principle for taking the PhD? By the way, there are quite a few letters there of Braithwaite's in which he, interestingly, is quite silent, but accepts, silent about Wittgenstein critically, but accepts accepts the notion that she doesn't have, and he is the secretary of the examination board, that she does not have to sit the exam. So all this run shows how wonderfully different and compassionate is Wittgenstein to this lady. So I just suggest that you should look at Priestley. And if I could add a point, at the side of all the processes, all the wonderful work, and I'm not being ironic there, really wonderful work of analysis, I think it's interesting then to sit back and say, what is the price and the significance of originality, especially when it is blended into an apparently familiar remark? And I think it's worthwhile noting how we look at Wittgenstein as a great creative person, and even if he has just got the hint of a point, or even briefly as adumbrated it in a counterintuitive way, that's a treasure. I don't want to overstate him, but the significance of originality in the context of quite properly doing a processual analysis of, which is a gradualist analysis of building up a picture and correctly position all these manuscripts. I don't know anybody who has left notice of this point, but the point is, Wittgenstein, what's your point? I have a new point in principle, or a new point about a familiar point. And so that may be very briefly flown. So keep that in mind with familiar things at length and with just a fragment of detail.
Okay. So thank you very much for these remarks. Yep.
I'm so sorry. Now we have time and no program, but I'm sure I can mention only this one topic, one part of Wittgenstein in the Nachlasses of the others that I didn't include on purpose because I was afraid that we would not have enough time, is the Nachlass or whatever remains from the Wittgenstein family. Because, first of all, of course, the letters, and not all of them are included in the publication that Professor McGuinness and I did, but they are in the complete correspondence. But anything else, I think, and that family members exchanged between themselves. Only yesterday we were talking that there is no document certifying how Ludwig transferred his fortune to his siblings, for example. And families keep these things usually, but it would be important. We don't know where it is, if it still exists. And I wanted to ask if anybody has ideas. Even more, we have Ilse Sommerwiller here who has worked a lot on family materials. Or if you have ideas what can be done, because I think this should be part of the Wittgenstein corpus in a way. No? It relates to Ludwig Wittgenstein very much. He was very loyal to his family, for worse or better. Yeah, if anybody has an idea that can be fruitful here, and next time we will continue with this topic included, family materials.
The photos, of course.
And of course the photos, yeah. So as I understood it from Alois from the very beginning, there should be the philosophical writings, the correspondence, photos, and here in Vienna, of course, the links to the cultural history, which is very important, the collective biography, because he knew through his family also many people, and this was basis of his thinking. Yeah. If anybody has something to say.
Okay, so more material on the platform, on Wittgenstein source. Expanding the range of materials.
Yeah.
Yeah.
600 letters
Mm-hmm.
of the family members exchanged with one another, and we keep them in the Brenner archives.
Yeah, and they are already on Wittgenstein source?
And Madeleine gradually I want to publish, but only a selection of the letters, because we have the letters from the former generations, from the grandfathers, grandparents of Ludwig, and it's the letters extend upon 4 generations.
Yeah.
But if you just read a few of them, you can pursue similar aspects which were important to the family. I think they all had a very high ethical commitment and a cultural engagement. And that's what you find everywhere in all the members of the family. And these aspects, I think, are very important to understand Wittgenstein himself, but because he was, in this sense, a very Austrian heritage he had. And I think one has to emphasize this point. It's really important. And also from the Jewish background, also this high ethical, this high ethos they had. And also they did a lot of caritative things without being mentioned. And that's also in the Jewish tradition. Insofar, you can also trace back to this aspect.
And also the stubbornness, the Wittgenstein stubbornness.
Yeah, certainly. They all were very individuals, everyone in his own way, and still they loved each other somehow, although they quarreled a lot, especially in the generation of Ludwig himself.
No, I remember Professor McGuinness writes in a footnote or in the introduction to the family letters that nobody in Cambridge would have believed that Ludwig was the nicest and most conciliatory in the family, because they didn't know the others. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to mention this. And now Desiree has something to announce, to say.
Okay.
So I just wanted to make a quick plug. Since the folks in the room that are gathered here have an interest in the digital methods and digital tools to study Wittgenstein, Sebastian, Sunday Greve, and I are putting together a small workshop within the Kirchberg conference next year to kind of highlight and bring together scholarship that focuses on digital methods and tools in the study of Wittgenstein. So it'll just be about 5 papers on one afternoon of the conference, so it'll be kind of nestled within the existing conference. And we are still kind of figuring out exactly who those 5 papers are going to be. We're especially encouraged, or we're especially hopeful that early career scholars or graduate students can be brought into kind of this network and learn more about some of these techniques that we're talking about and relying on and using in our own work. And so I have a short, or a half sheet that just kind of indicates some of the details that I just mentioned. And it would be lovely if folks in the room that might have graduate students or know of other early career scholars or might themselves be interested in participating, if you want to take a half sheet, maybe just as a mental reminder, to mention that to, again, folks that you think might be interested in that. We have my contact information and Sebastian's on the bottom. If anyone is interested in participating as one of the 5 papers, we would be happy to hear from you. But even if you're not wanting to be one of the 5 papers, then hopefully you will come and be in the audience and be part of that process of talking about those works, and then, again, kind of building that network, especially for folks that are not in the room right now. So I'll leave the half sheets on the back table. Again, if you want to take them as just a mental reminder for yourself, that would be lovely. Thanks.
Thank you for the plug and for the announcement. Okay, so I wonder whether there are any further questions for Jonathan Smith and his talk, concerning his talk, or other issues related to the Nachlass and the ongoing efforts to expand the range of materials that are to be offered on the Wittgenstein source. Yes. Mike. Thank you.
I have a question, actually, a detailed question about these pocket calendars. Are they accessible completely, or who
Sorry.
the pocket
diaries.
calendar, diary calendar of Wittgenstein. pocket notebooks.
Not the notebooks, I think the diaries, the
Yes,
journals.
I showed one
Calendar.
page.
Yeah,
Calendar.
How's the best way to put this? I don't know. My concern is that if you get a situation where things like provenance, relationship between documents, are not preserved or not included in any, for example, in online source, where something with one provenance and something with another provenance, something with more evidentiality, something with less evidentiality, all appear the same, which is possible online. It then leads to a form of scholarship which, you know, is not looking into how good the particular evidence is that they're looking at. We just need to make sure that we preserve that type of thing. I mean, I say this in the background of an educational system, an academic system, where scholarship has been eroded, virtually at every step. I mean, Piero Sraffa, we talked about him earlier. He took over 30 years to produce his edition of the works of David Ricardo. That was regarded when it was released, and is regarded now as a masterpiece of scholarship. Who could do that now except for an independent scholar? Anyone in the academic field, they've got to produce every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. You know, stuff has got to keep banging out there. You've got to feed the monster. But it's that with that background, it's not surprising that people don't look at the evidence that they're using in papers. The problem is, if you write a paper, and you've got hundreds of bits of evidence, bolstering your theory. Once you've done that, it's often quite difficult to knock it down, Someone has got to go through and check all those things. It's kind of a plea for old-fashioned scholarship, really. I mean, computers, online materials should help us to be better scholars. The comment I meant earlier about the Berger Nachlass edition, though I didn't make it very well, is the fact that we can see so much of the Nachlass in one place, does give us the chance to make those decisions where Wittgenstein's, for example, process helps us understand aspects. It allows us to use a huge amount of data, not just a tiny little bit. Potentially, if done well, digital scholarship is a great boon. But there's two words there: digital and scholarship. We've got to make sure that the scholarship is still there.
And probably one way of doing that would be just to have really good metadata included, which I think is already the case with Wittgenstein source, right? To make these evidential differences really visible to a scholar who is using those.
It would do if I'd done my bit, yeah. I think I owe you something.
I think we have to do much more work on this, and Jonathan has said a few things there too, because we are used to, too many of us and too many parts of us, including myself, are simply used to relate to anything Wittgenstein has written and has come to us in the Nachlass as sort of on the same level. But it's not on the same level. This one remark has been digested for decades, and the other thing he just put down, and we find it all edited in the same sort of books, and you find it in the same transcription outfit on our transcription site. It's only when you really go then to the facsimiles on Wittgenstein source, and if the entire thing is supported, assisted, accompanied by metadata that tell you this has gone through such and such a development, and that one over there not at all. That you are enabled to really process the differences, and one has to process the differences. One has to. One cannot take everything just at face value, and that's one of the points, Jonathan. Well, what does it mean to take it at face value? But it's not, as Wittgenstein says, die alles gleich machende Gewalt des Wörterbuchs, right? It's everything looks then the same when it is in print, but it's not. It hasn't got the same status. So we have to support the possibility of seeing that by metadata, as you said. Yeah.
I think there's.
I think already Van Richt was pointing out this and called this strata. What he called strata is the level of more or less finished works. And of course, this has enormous importance. But at the other side, I want to ask you, Alois, if you look at the level of a single remark, is it really important if this appears a lot of times later? If you look at the complete work, I completely agree. That makes much difference. But if you only look at a single remark, I think these differences are not so important in my opinion. Because he's rearranging maybe. He's not changing the remark, he's rearranging.
Yeah. I mean, as soon as you want to make use of one or another criterion for finding out what is it that Wittgenstein at the very end really would have a sort of defended and would have recommended to me as his 5-10 important words, then I think, yes, it makes sense to look at how many times has he gone back to this idea, worked on it, and developed it. And I, for myself, I have in this year worked a little bit on what is called Wittgenstein's philosophy of religion, and that philosophy of religion has been extracted from his so-called lectures on religious belief, which Volker has told us never were lectures on religious belief. And it has in addition been extracted from what has been published as remarks in Culture and Value. Now, those remarks published in Vermischte Bemerkung, Culture and Value, he has basically just written them once. It was accidental, a sort of accidental, aphoristic remarks. And I think we have to be careful to attribute to them the same philosophical status, value as remarks published in Philosophische Untersuchung, which he has been working on, not only in terms of rearranging, but also in terms of their own internal textual structure. So I think, yes, it is important to look at how much energy, philosophical energy, has he spent on specific ideas and remarks, if we want to find out what is it he really wanted to tell us. Yeah, I do not exclude that sometimes he may also just have had a brilliant idea and wrote it down and that was it, but you could turn my argument around and say it's precisely the other things which he had to work on again and again that he was unhappy with, and those remarks which he wrote only once he was happy with. But
both can be interesting.
Yeah.
I think Arthur has another question. Yes.
I don't want to overdo my time. Against what you said, but in support of the significance of what you said, just because he says it once or briefly, he may not have had time. And someone who has a philosophy that he wants to disclose. It fits everything in his understanding, or if it doesn't, he wants to make that clear. So I think, for example, the religious theme that you talked about and developed in Oxford, which was basically, no, he isn't in a gut-wrenching way saying that all religious discourse is, oh, no. It's like walking on a tightrope. It's a very difficult balance. And it's using language which is so precarious, is approaching an impossible task. And I think that that talk, I'm not being patronizing, was an extraordinarily important one, because it showed that the very familiarity, developing an earlier theme, has in it a shockwave that we hadn't recognized. And I've seen similar remarks he does about astronomy. Sir James Jeans in cosmology, whom he gave a dressing down in one remark, and he was there at the lecture when he came to Cambridge and said, utter rubbish. And yet, on the edge now, and I'm just jumping forward to the present day, one or two people have heard me say this, I think it bears repeating. Look for a parallel in almost the impossibility of standing on the edge of the frontiers of a subject. And he needn't spend much time on it. He can just in that brief way say, we missed this. And how it applies now to current issues in cosmology is extraordinarily enormous, because the standard model of physics is near collapse. Some people have said that we bolted on the Higgs boson, the Higgs field, it turns out to be a field, and it can't hold it in the standard quantum mechanics. These are not mystical arguments. And when you get to dark matter, it's almost impossible to bolt it on. You just about can. But dark energy, which is covering 74% of the universe, there's no even experimental sketch of how it would fit at all. So what I wanted to say is, your talk in Oxford went to a theme that I'm quite sure I've seen in Wittgenstein, and he's struggling to say, I'm almost dead, please go away with this. It's a prescient insight, and the point is this. He has exposed an area of the empirical universe, and whether or not we view that as religion or not is a different question, but the point is, the words literally fail, and we do not know how to model them. And so I leave that with you as an example which I think is extraordinarily important. And it also applies if you go deep into art to do with creativity, deep into mathematics or into infinitesimals, the equations creak and collapse and shiver. And he knew this from the various talks to 1915 onwards. So I'm struggling to say this is an extraordinarily important insight in its brevity. So he had a sense of this, so we must go pretty deep with him. He's not my hero, wrote bullshit at times, but what I'm trying to say is we must give renewed attention to this. And I just round off, I'm sorry I've gone on, but I think it's important to bring it back. In an area where I have some expertise, this is also happening with AI. Your whole argument this afternoon of the erosion of difference is where technology as well has used people, and they have used it to erode their sense of difference. And that applies at the most popular level of propaganda and fake news, but also in the area of technology, which you use so wisely, it is eroding difference and effort all the time with algorithms that are so successful, we almost give up bothering to think. And so what the counsel that you raised generally is an extraordinarily important one, to keep the mind refined and fresh. And that was what Wittgenstein was really saying. And it applies in technology and science. And it's a very important lesson which hovers in what you have been saying. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, then I think we should wrap it up and thank our speaker for his contribution.